My name is Melinda Brown Donovan, and I serve the School of Theology and Ministry, or STM, as Associate Director of Continuing Education. STM offers a wide array of graduate courses leading to degrees and certificates in theology and ministry, as well as a number of continuing education opportunities offered both on campus, like this one, and online. We have more information on both the on-campus and online programs at the entrance. Since our on-campus brochure was published, which many of you may have already received, we've added 2 more events this fall, and I'd like to call your attention to those. The first is on Monday, November 4th, and we'd like to invite you to an opening celebration of an exhibit of Thomas Merton's correspondence with some of the Jesuit fathers at Boston College. This opening reception and viewing will take place at the Theology and Ministry Library on the Brighton campus from 4 o'clock until 6 o'clock p.m. In addition, the scripture scholar Gary Anderson will present a lecture on Thursday, December 5th at 6 o'clock at the Cadogan Alumni Center on the Brighton campus, and he'll be speaking on the primacy of charity in the Christian life. More information on these events will be available on our website. Our thanks to the Boston College Bookstore, who you may have seen at the entrance. They're here this evening with a few titles that the presenters have written, and they're offering these at a 20% discount. Now, without further ado, I would like to welcome Father Mark Massa to the podium. Father Massa is Dean of the School of Theology and Ministry and Professor of Church History.
Thank you, and welcome to you all. And thanks, Melinda, for the little infomercial at the beginning. That's good. We are honored to have 2 such distinguished speakers with us tonight. Mary Evelyn Tucker and her husband, John Grimm, are senior lecturers and research scholars at Yale University. They teach in a master's program in religion and ecology between the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and the Yale Divinity School. Mary Evelyn is a specialist in East Asian religions, especially Confucianism. John is a specialist in indigenous traditions, especially Native American religions. Their concern for the growing environmental crisis led them to organize a series of 10 conferences on world religions and ecology, which were held at the Center for the Study of World Religions at the Harvard Divinity School between 1995 and 1998. Together, they are series editors for the 10 volumes from the conferences distributed by Harvard University Press. After the conference series, Mary Evelyn and John founded the Forum on Religion and Ecology at a culminating conference at the United Nations in 1998. They now direct that forum at Yale, in addition to their teaching. Mary Evelyn has also worked closely with evolutionary philosopher Brian Swimme for some 25 years. Together, they created a multimedia project entitled The Journey of the Universe, which consists of a film and a DVD series of conversations. The companion book, which they authored, is published by Yale University Press. It was published in 2011. She is also co-editor of another volume, Bringing Science and Religion Together, whose title is When Worlds Converge. Here, then, in Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm, is an extraordinary partnership of groundbreaking scholarship and passionate work for the care of our world. Please join me in welcoming Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm.
Thanks, Father Mark. Okay. There we go.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming today, and it's wonderful to see old friends and new friends. We're going to do a very general overview of this field of religion and ecology, which is about 15 years old now, so quite new. But we would say from the beginning that what we're trying to draw on are cultural values that come from a whole range of sources. That is, of course, world religions, humanitarian and secular values, environmental ethics, biophilia, which is Ed Wilson's term for the love of nature and so on, as well as aesthetics and the arts. So this is a field that encompasses religion, but also beyond religion, and especially arts and even environmental values not connected to religions. So it's this one. This one? Okay. So how did I get interested in this topic? As a young person, it seems like 100 years ago, but it was 73, 74, I went to teach in Japan at a women's university. And Japan was an extraordinary place. Of course, it was almost like the end of the Meiji era, though. It was very, very different from what it is today. I was quite an unusual person, being almost 6 feet tall and blue eyes and red hair and so on. But here is a Shinto torii at the site in Hiroshima. Shinto, as a base of Japan, was fascinating to me, but so was Buddhism, especially Zen Buddhism. And I studied it quite intensely there, both up at the Jesuit University in Tokyo, as well as in Kyoto. The other tradition that captured me essentially for my own research was Confucianism. And that's a tradition that very few people know about in the West, but it's a tradition that has influenced China, Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and so on, and has probably influenced more people than any other tradition on the planet. This is a castle where the daimyo in the pre-modern period in Japan lived and controlled the local government. There are Confucian temples in Japan. Confucianism is part of the educational system, the learning system, but it's also the family values and so on. And it continues to endure across East Asia as the ethical glue of those societies. When I went to Japan, as I mentioned, in 73, so it's 40 years ago, this is Mount Fuji. Here is Mount Fuji in more recent years. Here were many of the extraordinary the paddy fields that went right up these very rugged mountains. And that's, again, true throughout Asia. Intensive agriculture. Here is nuclear power, and we know now the huge problem of Fukushima, still leaking into the Pacific, still no sight of containing that. In southern China, of course, there's Guilin, one of the most famous tourist spots in the world, absolutely gorgeous. But China is filled with immense, relentless environmental problems. Most of the rivers are terribly polluted. I just got back from a 2-week trip to China in September as part of this revival of Confucianism for what they're calling ecological civilization. There are 66,000 protests a year in China alone on the environment. The government, against great odds, has put this notion, this policy of ecological civilization into the Constitution. The president in the National Congress meeting in November mentioned it 15 times. It is against great odds. And I look forward to further discussion about this with some of you. Clearly, this was also China when I first went in the early 80s. Bicycles, this is the conditions now. Very difficult to breathe, and of course the effect on children in particular is enormous. So in short, the conditions of East Asia and Asia as a whole, because I've traveled extensively in India and Southeast Asia and Indonesia as well. But over 40 years, the conditions with rapid and relentless modernization have put millions and billions, really, of people up against tremendous odds of health, of survival, of food security. India and China will change the face of our planet, and they already are. So the question for me, and we'll talk about it in greater detail in a few moments, was what are the values from these cultures and these traditions that will contribute to an environmental ethics that is indigenous to those parts of the world?
my own entry then into this work in religion and ecology comes initially through my upbringing in North Dakota. I come from an agricultural hunting family, so that ease of relationship with the natural world was something I experienced quite early. But when I went east to study at Fordham University and met Thomas Berry, who I want to talk about more in a moment, he suggested that I return to my home region and begin studies with American Indian peoples. And initially I did with Anishinaabe or Ojibwe peoples, and after some years I had an introduction to Crow or Apsaloke peoples. And this is one of the branch families, the Cummins family. Mary Evelyn and I are adopted into the Birding Ground family, but I wanted to picture the Cummins family because the elder couple, John Cummins and Mary Cummins, he is what the Crow call an akbalia. AK is an instrumental in the Crow language. If you put it in front of a word, it indicates that that which comes after is capable of doing things. A balia is a person. So an akbalia is what we might call a shaman. So when I first met John Cummins and would begin to study with John Cummins, one of the first insights that he wanted me to understand is that it's not a medicine man, it's not an individual, but rather a medicine family. So I wanted to picture this as an interesting, very simple family photo, but when a ceremonial takes place where John and Mary are involved, that whole family is engaged in ceremonial activities at home. And of course, Mary Cummins, the tribal specialist in herbal plants. John Cummins also leads sun dances. So this is a ceremonial that I've focused on. And the Religion and Ecology Project obviously has very close connection with symbolic knowledge, symbolic awareness. So we see the buffalo, the sense of the primary symbol of sustenance and food on the northern plains. There's an eagle in the upper top. This is an ashkise, in the Crow say, a big lodge, a cosmic lodge. It presences what they see as the powers of the universe. Now, of course, this focus in religion and ecology makes a great deal of sense, but I've found in my work with Native American peoples that this turn was crucial. Namely, this is the sense of political voice, the sovereignty of Native peoples throughout the American hemisphere, trying to assert their right to determination in their own homelands. So here we have a demonstration against the tar sands in northern Alberta. It's interesting to realize that Native American peoples are taking the lead in much resistance to environmentally damaging projects now. So along with this then, the international communication of Indigenous people has become a rather significant part of this Religion and Ecology Project. And of course, all of this is related to our meetings in the late 60s and 70s with Thomas Berry. Both Mary Evelyn and myself studied with Thomas. Mary Evelyn then went on to Columbia to study in their East Asian program. I did a dissertation with Thomas and saw him then make his turns as a Passionist priest from a focus on cultural history. So his PhD was in cultural history, and especially towards world religions, and then the issue of cosmology in world religions, namely the stories that people have that explain the nature of reality. And that turn led him increasingly towards the thought of Teilhard de Chardin and the sense of cosmology and ecology. So that's the connection that's embedded in this Religion and Ecology Project, and especially these works. And I'd just like to note the ones on my far left, your right, Sacred Universe and the Christian Future and the Fate of Earth. Thomas's final works published in 2009, the year that he died. And he was fully lucid and aware of these works till the very end. So he was able to give us a sense of his understanding of our changing environmental situation.
Thomas, way before even environmental studies programs, had a deep penetrating sense of what we were facing, what is upon us now, in fact, because he said that no previous human community has faced such a comprehensive crisis threatening ecosystems and species on a global scale, and this was 40 years ago. We know now that we have these issues of population growth, of increased consumption. We have increasing climate chaos, one would say, recognized around the world, even if it isn't in the US. We also have a biodiversity loss of immense proportions. Scientists would say, and at the Natural History Museum in New York, we are in the midst of a 6th extinction period where species are going extinct due to anthropogenic causes. There are 5 previous periods of extinction, but those were caused by climate change and by asteroids. We are now the asteroid. Thomas Berry then said, we have ethics for homicide and suicide and genocide, but not for biocide and geocide. It was on that level of significance. And there is a group now working, even Polly Higgins, on a project called Ecocide. And what are the rights of future generations with regard to that? Thomas's voice was powerful for the natural world, where he said the natural world is the resonance of the divine world. He said this is one of the great scriptures. It's not only the written scriptures, but the earth itself and its evolutionary power and magnificence is a scripture which we need to learn to read. One of his most famous statements was, the universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. Because obviously, if it is a collection of objects, we can destroy it easily and relentlessly, cutting off ancient mountaintops, acidifying oceans, polluting the air, creating toxicities such as never been seen before on our planet. It was this then that led to the conference series in beginning 1995 for 3 years to 1998 at Harvard.
So our experiences in the study of world religions brought us to this question, what contribution could we make to the environmental dilemmas that we faced? And it framed itself for us as a straightforward question. What is it in the religious traditions that can be retrieved? So we began this project in 1995-96, and it was a 3-year project where we brought together over 800 scholars of religious traditions in conferences dedicated to a specific tradition. And we asked them to write papers that were then revised for publication in later volumes. But the method that generally the overview that we can see now is that it was an effort to ask what is it that individuals or communities within a tradition, how have they interacted with local bioregions? And is it possible then to bring that forward and reevaluate it? Do they say anything to us today, or are they simply historical references that are interesting in the development of the tradition, or do they speak to us today? And if they do, does it cause for a tradition to encounter a call to reconstruct itself to meet the demands of our time? So this whole question of retrieval, reevaluation, and reconstruction comes to each of the traditions. And this would be just one very straightforward example from Genesis 26-28. Many of you know the dominion verse where the human is given the call or the charge of dominion over the earth. And there's been a reevaluation of that language. What does it mean, or how should we understand it? And this sense of stewardship that emerges then often is associated still with an anthropocentric tone to it. Care for creation has emerged in many of the evangelical circles. You find reverence for life has a strong resonance with indigenous traditions also, and say even Albert Schweitzer, so even outside of religious traditions itself. But this sense of participation is a rather new moment in the human understanding of ourselves in an ecological context, the sense of interdependence. And so these new understandings of scientific ecology bring many of the religious traditions to evaluate its relationships with the natural world, and in that sense enter into a broadened ethics. So these traditions, as they reinvent themselves, we find that these values that appear, they're shared values across the religious traditions, And reverence is obviously found in many of the, in the world's religions, but very differently expressed. Now, say, for example, the reverence of a hunter in indigenous traditions and the humility of a hunter before the hunt, or the sense in the mystical traditions of Rumi and the Neoplatonic character of his singing to the natural world. They're very different, but there's a reverence then that has to be realized. And then respect for a myriad species and the sense of restraint now calling out to the religious traditions, and the character of redistribution and the justice issues that emerge in these discussions, as well as a sense now of reciprocity with all of life. Again, the scientific tones of ecology bring us to insights in this regard that are strikingly new. Responsibility raises all of the questions of environmental ethics, and obviously ethics in different parts of the globe and with different religions will appear very differently. They will not all be based on Western ethical perspectives. In East Asia, Confucian, Taoism, East Asian Buddhist thought will enter into these questions of responsibility. And then finally, restoration, which is the question of resilience, isn't it? How do we restore degraded areas with a sense that they will maintain themselves? But the question presents itself, how do we restore? To what end, or to what degree? What is it restoration to what particular ecological configuration? So the religious traditions participating in these questions is, in a sense, revisiting through these values. It's revisiting an area of thought that was given over to the scientific community almost exclusively, and by that I mean cosmology. The sense of the understanding of reality. In many ways, the religions are beginning to return to this question, and they are in dialogue now with the sciences rather than one trumping the other. The conference series that we did with the religious traditions then went through in '98, and we brought together several culminating conferences, the first at the United Nations and then at the American Museum of Natural History. And Bill Moyers, he led the panels where representatives from the world religions were interviewed by Moyers in terms of this ecological commitment. So these were very interesting gatherings, and it was in 1998 that we also introduced the Forum on Religion and Ecology. The website is indicated here, and more on that in a bit. But this was a major step for us then to begin to bring the academic exploration as an academic field, and to begin to turn and join with the sense of an engaged force, namely a sense that there is work to be done on the ground. So the Forum on Religion and Ecology was undergirded by these published volumes that came out of the conference series at Harvard. This was over a 7-year period, and these volumes are still in print and still serve a purpose. And we also helped to support a peer-reviewed journal now in this field, which scholars can now publish their works and help develop this academic field.
So there were 800 scholars who participated in these conferences over at the Harvard Divinity School Center for the Study of World Religions. And afterwards, there was a great deal of energy for moving forward. So that's why in New York, 1,000 people came to the Natural History Museum for this conference. And the head of the provost there, Mike Novacek, said, "You can have the IMAX Theater rent-free because this is so important for the future of the planet." My challenge here today is actually, what is BC doing for religion and ecology? And what are the Jesuit schools doing for religion and ecology? I want to speak on that for just a minute before I go into why this website might be useful. I did a survey, actually, of the Jesuit schools and what are some of the courses that are happening or not happening. There's 80 courses here in the theology department, undergraduate and graduate. There's almost nothing in religion and ecology except for Mary Ann Hinsdale, and I believe John Darr does a course in Bible and ecology. So that is a challenge, I think. I looked at Georgetown, very, very little, almost nothing. Fordham, our student Christiana Peppard is teaching a little bit in the Lincoln Center School. Marquette, we can go through all of these Jesuit universities, and I can tell you, I was left sleepless about this, because I think this is our greatest challenge. And if BC has a graduate, such as James Balog, who made this film, Chasing Ice. Have you seen it? How many people have seen Chasing Ice? About the melting of the glaciers, which he calls the dying of the glaciers. It is a moving film. It was shown here in April. 200 people came to see it. But as a BC graduate who went to the COP conference in Copenhagen and so on, I think this is something that needs to be taken up all across the Catholic universities. So this website may be useful, may be helpful. It has annotated bibliographies, the text, statements from leaders, engaged project. It took 7 years to create. It is very full, continually being updated, syllabi and so on. A whole section on climate change. And there is a new group called the Catholic Coalition for Climate Change, which I really urge you to take a look at. We have a monthly newsletter announcing events, news events from all over the world, and so on. After the conferences at Harvard, we did another conference on religion and animals, persuaded by a number of our friends, especially from the Humane Society of the US, as well as people working in animal behavior, that we had to understand humans as a species among other species. This was an amazing conference with science, religion, art, and so on. This volume came out from Columbia. At Yale, there's a Center for Bioethics, which has a whole seminar on issues of animals and the treatment of animals, the study of animals, and so on. I'll say something about the blessing of animals at St. Francis's feast day a little bit later. Religion and climate change. We did one of the first conferences on this topic at Harvard in 2001, and the Daedalus volume that's online is fully available on all the world's religions, what they have to say about this. Bill McKibben is in here as well. Mike McElroy, who was head of the environment program at Harvard, in addition to some other scientists. We also helped with a conference at Yale in 2010 on climate change, bringing together the scientists from the environmental school as well as at the divinity school. Now, I'm really pleased as well to mention one of the most important resources for all of you. And Marty Ostro is here. I hope he'll raise his hand. He's so modest. And he lives in Cambridge. He's an independent filmmaker, but he made this extraordinary film called Renewal, 8 case studies of religious grassroots environmentalism in the US. We had a wonderful conference at Harvard, thanks to Marty and Terry Rockefeller, his co-producer. And we brought people from all over the US who are doing really quite heroic work, trying to stop mountaintop removal, working to stop toxicities, and so on. I urge you to look at this film, to use it in your classes or in your churches, and so on. We've also worked for about 20 years with Orbis Press on a series of ecology and justice, because when we first began this work, some people would say, oh, ecology or environment, it's whitewater rafting, or it's something, out there. And they were like, oh, social justice and Catholic social teachings, that's what's important. And it's taken a long, long time to bring these notions together. I'm a civil rights person from the 60s and the 70s. This whole notion of what is happening to people around the planet as a result just of climate change. We already have millions of climate refugees. This is due to our actions. So justice and environment are intrinsically linked. The suffering across our country from the droughts last summer, we can name it over and over again, the tornadoes, the floods, Katrina, Sandy. if you lived through Sandy and you saw the suffering of people who are still rebuilding, unbelievable. So you will recognize many of the people in this series, including Thomas Berry, but Leonardo Boff, one of the great liberation theologians, who, after reading Thomas Berry, understood you can't have liberation of people without the land. He is one of the most important spokespersons in Brazil. Everyone pays attention to Leonardo, and he is talking about the importance of these issues and also of a great epic story that matters as we tell this story. Larry Rasmussen, Rosemary Ruther, etc. What we've tried to do, and I think you are probably as well in the environmental studies minor that's here at the college, is work with scientists and people in policy. Eric Chasen is here and a valued friend for many, many years. If we don't work with the scientists, we are just talking to ourselves, because the scientists are the ones who are giving us this information that is riveting. And I can tell you, many of the scientists, especially at Encore, the National Center for the Atmospheric Research outside of Boulder, are in despair because the American public is not listening to what is being said. We have to work with people in science and policy, and we did that at Harvard, we did it at the conferences in New York, and we continue to do it at Yale. It's not easy. It is not easy, but it needs to be done, and we need those partners. So we've had Ed Wilson came to the conferences at Harvard. Peter Crane, he was head of the Kew Botanical Gardens in the UK. He was head of science at the Field Museum in Chicago. He's now our dean, tremendously supportive of this work. Jane Lubchenco, the past head of NOAA, one of the most respected oceanographers on the planet. Again, very, very supportive. She happens to have Catholic background. She happens to get that religion might matter. Ursula Goodenough at Washington University, and Tom Lovejoy, one of the inventors of the idea of biodiversity with Ed Wilson. In policy, Gus Speth, head of UN Development Program, had founded NRDC, on and on. Nick Robinson in terms of law, Richard Norgaard for ecological economics. These are people in various disciplines who understand why ethics matters, why religion matters, and they want to partner. We need to be partnering. A new book is coming out that John's going to talk about in ecology and religion.
Our situation, teaching situation now at Yale Forestry and Environmental Studies, as well as a joint degree program with Yale Divinity School, brings us into interesting reflection with scientists with regard to a broader topic. Let me call it environmental humanities. So as we began to do our latest research and efforts to publish an overview of this field in religion and ecology, we found Island Press was interested in the project, and we were interested in their efforts to reverse our field of study in an effort to draw the science community into consideration of the significance of environmental humanities in this question. So consequently, we decided on ecology and religion as a topic that scientists might pick up this book if they see the ecology and then be hooked or be interested in the role that the broader humanities voice coming through religion might bring to the topic. The cover suggests also that a sense of a anthropocosmic person. We've recently had this term developed by the geological community called the Anthropocene to characterize our times, namely the human presence and formation of the surface of the planet. One of the interesting ironies is that the committee in the Geological Society of America that determines the names of stages of Earth development has not agreed yet on Anthropocene, because any geologic stage has to show itself in the layers of the Earth. And it will take probably several 100,000, if not 1 million years, for Earth effect on the planet to show itself on the layer. So what is it that has captured human imagination so much with the use of this term Anthropocene? Because we know we fluoresce around this planet. And I think that's what we're after in this project too, is to begin to examine what's the nature of the human. What is it especially about the religious character of the human, homo religiosus, as we enter into our ecological phase? And this project, obviously, you can pick up, it has its academic side, and then its grassroots engaged character also. The evidence of religious leaders in this regard is primary. The new Pope Francis I has made very strong statements on the environment. So also Benedict XVI. He has some very penetrating, strong, supportive statements about the need for environmental concern, as well as John Paul II. So our hope is that we might be able to push some of these religious leaders, especially Francis I, towards an encyclical on the environment, to begin to develop a teaching document in this regard. Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury, has spoken on this. The Dalai Lama to the top, your right, a very significant voice in Buddhism, and also the ecumenical patriarch, Bartholomew on the bottom. Many of you may not know that he has taken an active role for several decades now. And Mary Evelyn will talk later about some symposiums that he's led focused on water. But these religious leaders, and in other traditions, Thich Nhat Hanh in Buddhism, and at the bottom the Dharma master Chung Yung, the Tzuchi tradition of Buddhism in Taiwan is very active in environmental recycling and in social justice, eco-justice. The evangelical church, as much as they have resisted some environmental concern, leaders are beginning to surface in that tradition. And since Joel Martin, and obviously the Episcopalian Church has been a leader in this regard with the scientist as a bishop, Catherine Jefferts Schori. The question then of environmental justice, it confronts us daily, doesn't it, as we examine the effects of our human presence on the planet. And yet we have significant leaders outside of the religious community also. Wangari Maathai in the top middle of this slide, Nobel Prize winner and the founder of the Green Belt movement in Kenya, a remarkable voice who was moving women's movement towards an understanding that simply planting trees, that simple act, could have profound positive implications for the environmental presence and concern of a country like Kenya. So this modeling that we're seeing around the world from religious leaders and others.
Now we get down to the problems. I think most of us here are more than aware of the problems, but I think it's very important that we're not so optimistic that we can just bring religions on board easily. And as I say, that's why I was making this very strong, if the Jesuits can't lead on this issue, who can? The problems of religion are vast and multiple. Intolerance, dogmatism, exclusive claims to truth, and so on. This is an example in Ayodhya in India of a mosque that was destroyed by radical Hindus in 2003. And we arrived in Delhi that same year, just after this happened in December. The country was in an uproar. Delhi was armed guards everywhere, including in the hotel. This is very, very serious tensions around the world, Hindu and Muslim and Jewish, and on and on. We have to pay attention to these issues clearly. The otherworldly orientation, and this applies to the Christian tradition too. People will say, it's just salvation outside the world, or your personal salvation. And this is why Beth Johnson's talk this summer in July here at Boston College was very, very important, because she's one of the theologians who are addressing this issue. There are others as well, but I think we need to pay attention to what she's trying to do. Nature being devalued. This is Boniface up in Germany, cutting down sacred forests. The anthropocentric focus of many of our traditions, that humans are what matter. And that's what Beth Johnson and Rosemary Ruther and many, many others are trying to shift that focus. The promise of religion. Clearly, there are large numbers of people. The UN that we have worked with, UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, since 1987. We have helped them with programs on religion and the environment. And they consider religions to be the largest NGOs, non-governmental organizations in the world. There are 1 billion Muslims, there's 1 billion Hindus, there's 1 billion Confucians, there's 1.2 billion Catholics. That's why we feel if the Pope does an encyclical on the environment, it will be a game changer, just huge. And even when we mention it to our scientists, atheist friends, they understand that is a game changer. So the institutional authority, if we can bring this to bear for change, and I can tell you in this recent conference in China where Du Weiming said, China is such a hard country to change, but if the government makes this shift, it is top down, and if they go towards this ecological culture and civilization, something radical may happen. The power of text and tradition, this whole effort to reread scriptures and tradition in light of this most pressing problem. I would say this is the most pressing problem for humans in 150,000 years of being Homo sapiens sapiens. We are up against it, and every indicator will tell us that. We hear talks every week and 2 or 3 times a week at our School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, at national conferences, we go to international conferences. It is frightening. It's frightening for our children, our students, and the next generations. Education and moral persuasion. Here we are with a school that's reaching out for education. We have to incorporate this into our classes and our thinking. Environmental ethics in action. This is solar panels on the Divinity School at Yale. The evangelicals are definitely getting into this. When we did the conference at Harvard in '97 on Christianity and ecology, the evangelicals were there. All the different Protestant groups, the Catholic groups, the Orthodox groups were there. That's, again, many years ago now. What is it that we're trying to do in terms of this retrieval, reevaluation, and reconstruction? We're also trying to reconceive, rethink, what is religion? It's not just how it's been defined in the Western religions. This has been the great gift of study and travel around the world, especially in Asia, to see how religions work in very, very different ways. So this broadening understanding is what John's referred to, religious ecology, that traditions have woven people into ecosystems, agricultural systems, hunting systems, for millennia. What does that mean for our times? What is a religious ecology? And how is it woven us into a cosmological understanding? Where do we come from? How do we understand our origin stories? And more on that in a minute. So religious cosmologies are humans emerging from the universe. What does that mean? Especially now that we know, and Princeton's just redefined, I think, 13.8 billion years of our universe unfolding. What does that mean? We are moving into a new understanding of cosmogenesis, of a changing, dynamic universe. It's only 150 years old in human consciousness. What does this mean for religious sensibilities and ethical sensibilities? So the religious ecology, this sense of being embedded in nature, the whole notion of immanence. If we take a tradition such as Christianity and say incarnation is central to this tradition, that matter is sacred, therefore, and immanental incarnational sensibility is also transformative. How can we destroy our world if that is part of a tradition of 1.2 billion people?
Just as much as the question of religious traditions entering into their ecological phase, it brings us to a re-examination of these traditions. It also provides a ground for dialogue. That question of the relationship of religious traditions still confronts us as an unanswered question. And this project, I think, is not attempting to explain that tradition as if to sweep it off the table, but rather to provide a new ground for dialogue. And that new ground for dialogue is interesting, say, in the ecumenical activity on the Christian side of things, where a thinker like Maximus the Confessor, and this work, the Philokalia, is a late 16th century or so work in which a number of expressions or religious expressions from the early Christian fathers are gathered. And Maximus the Confessor is one of the last of the church fathers that the Protestant, Orthodox, and Catholic traditions will all accept and look back to. And so Maximus provides one of these interesting moments to reflect on the early Christian tradition and its sense of this partakers of a divine nature, and certainly the very clear Christian message of a sense of God's eternity and participating in that, and coming to be like Him, the image and likeness verse of Genesis. But then Maximus enters into that very interesting Orthodox interpretation of deification. And the sense of deification by grace is obviously a sense that the divine leads the human into that possibility of divinization or deification. It is through deification that all things are reconstituted. That's an interesting turn, where Maximus is now phrasing not simply human deification, but rather all of creation. It achieves their permanence then, and it is for its sake, this deification, that what is not is brought into being and given existence. So the sense that the fecundity of creation makes possible the deification of the human, or the sense of, I guess I would, my own limited understanding, I would put it the sense of coming to an understanding of our authenticity, coming to an understanding of the fullness of who we are, of what it is that we're created for. It is for the sake of that what is not is brought into being, the sense of creation coming into being to fulfill this possibility of deification. So these ideas continue in Orthodox theology, where we have this consistent testimony to the sacredness of creation. There's some wonderful stories of a Protestant friend who had not experienced communion in the Orthodox manner, bread and wine, and an Orthodox priest friend of his says, well, let's go out into the field someday and we'll celebrate the Eucharist together. They did, and the Orthodox priest then gives him in the spoon the host and the wine and puts it in his mouth. And this Protestant friend says, I knew that the Orthodox had a Eucharistic theology that was vital because it tasted like flesh, or it felt like flesh. So this sense that in this tradition, this incarnational reality remains vital and active, and it takes practice or shape. For example, in the activity of the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew, who framed this call for an understanding of ecological sin, that when humans willfully pollute or destroy environments, it should be called an ecological sin, that we should attend to that as an unacceptable act of the human that counters or moves against the whole call towards deification. So this tradition, and this would be just one example, in every tradition we could find statements from leaders, and within the thought tradition where we could see a rethinking and a reconstituting of new energies within these traditions.
So the patriarch, with a name like patriarch, you would wonder, but he is one of the most extraordinary human beings, Bartholomew. We were very fortunate to go on 5 of these symposia, which were focused on water issues. But they brought together UN officials, a lot of EU ministers, very high-level people committed to this, as well as people from the various religious communities. I want to just draw attention to the one in the Adriatic Sea, because it ended in Venice with a joint statement from the Pope and the Patriarch that you can see online. An amazing call for action, amazing call for transformation. The one in the Arctic was also absolutely arresting because you could see, and we can still see, as Chasing Ice tells us, the melting of the glaciers, the climate change that is upon us. In the Amazon, there was a reconciliation with indigenous peoples and the patriarch. Very, very powerful symposium. So, again, what are we trying to do with religion? Expanding this notion of its nature and its function. We have in this new book 4 notions of orienting, grounding, nurturing, and transforming. So the notion is that religions orient us to the cosmos. They ground us in the earth, in the ecology. They nurture us through ritual, and they transform us through ethics. And this is developed with examples in the book from the patriarch, from Confucianism, from indigenous peoples, and so on. As we conclude this talk, this is one of the most iconic views of our planet. And there's a short video, just 15 minutes, I think, called Overview, which has now had 2 million people viewing it. And it's the astronauts talking about their experience. There's also a beautiful book called Home Planet by Kevin Kelly, which is transforming for so many of them. How can it not be? We've discovered several thousand exoplanets, right? But we haven't discovered life, and I'm not against any kind of space explorations, but this is, as far as we know, so far, a unique and special blue-green planet. And that is the challenge that this talk brings us to. Also, this sense that science is giving us of how we live in a universe, not just here in Boston, not just here in the US, North America, a planet. We live in a solar system. We live amidst 1 trillion galaxies. We live in such vastness of space. Very few people, I think, understand this, except astronomers like, again, Eric Jason and so on. But what is it for the human, both understanding and imagination, to enter into this large-scale story of evolution? And Eric has done books on this, The Epic of Evolution, Cosmic Evolution. He's taught a course at Harvard for 35 years on this. Very, very popular course. And what we've tried to do, and scientists have helped us, including Eric, is to tell the story in a way that's accessible to a larger public. And this is the Journey of the Universe project, which is a book and a film, which went on PBS, which won a little regional Emmy and so on, and also a series of conversations. So the film is just an invitation into a story told in 55 minutes of wonder, awe, beauty, intricacy, elegance, complexity. Complexity and elegance are terms that scientists love. If a mathematician gets an elegant solution to a problem, the whole universe is something we are beginning to appreciate with these kinds of understandings, again, given through science. So the film is that invitation into beauty and complexity and elegance. The book fleshes it out a little bit more. Each chapter of the film and the book is one scientific story with a metaphor and with an image. So we're bringing together science and humanities to tell this in a way that is accessible. It's different from a scientific classroom and so on. But if we can't make this story known, we will miss one of the most astounding aspects of our time. And that is, since the Second World War, you can say in 60 years, what science has discovered about every aspect of this story, from astronomy and physics to geology and chemistry and biology and botany down to cell biology, is an explosion of knowledge. But how can we see it as like a string of pearls, as an epic story? That changes everything because it places us within the story. We see ourselves as part of it. We see ourselves as coming from supernova, that carbon-based life came from the explosion of stars. Why did we do the third part of this? We have a series of conversations with scientists and historians in a series of 10 short interviews to deepen our understanding, to point us to huge bibliographies of what science is working on in these various fields. And finally, we have 10 interviews with people working on environmental issues, eco-cities, eco-economics, education, race, permaculture, food. What does it mean to work in this sense that we need to transform our societies radically and implicitly toward a flourishing future? And how are people doing this inspired by an epic of evolution framework? That is the purpose of this project. It's the offering, imperfect as it might be, but in conjunction with people who are working in a very science-based epic of evolution, such as Eric Chasen is here at Harvard. A big history approach is also taking it from human history out to cosmic and Earth history. So this is coming from a whole variety of sources. We end simply with the Tree of Life, this iconic sensibility that we are part, as Darwin said, of this Tree of Life. And if it is to continue, it is really resting in our hands in certain ways. Not that life won't go on, but how will we be co-creators with this process? Thank you.
And a final thought before we have our exchange with questions. It's an interesting, iconic moment, isn't it, to reflect on the Earth from space and to think of that now as our image of life, and to reflect back on our ancestors who quite often chose the tree to image that branching character of life. This would suggest to me, not only do we carry with us our ancient reflections, but we're also reaching out to new understanding. So I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much. Happy for questions. I think there's going to be a microphone moving around.
As a student of the BC divestment campaign, and I couldn't help but notice that you mentioned Bill McKibben and a lot of information on climate change. I just wanted to know, what's your view on divestment and BC as a religious institution? What should we respond and approach this issue?
Well, thank you. I hope people are familiar with what Bill McKibben and 360.org has launched.
350.
How many people are familiar with the divestment campaign? Okay, so universities are being asked to divest from oil and gas and so on. My short answer is I support it. You know, we're working on it at Yale. NYU's just brought it forward. Columbia just voted on it, I think, this week. So I certainly hope that BC is, I read about it online, so I'm delighted that you're doing it, and I think there were a couple students here from that work, and I wish you success. Just put up your hands there. Let's give a shout out for all of you working on that. Bill McKibben has been an amazing leader in so many areas, especially on the Keystone Pipeline in particular. Yes, are there other?
But we're also very aware, just to put a tag on that too, we're very aware of the challenges because we're over 400 parts per million now. Then the title of that organization is 350.
Yeah, to my understanding, I think the general of the Jesuit community in Rome has written a letter in which he said that years ago, in one of the congregations, the Jesuits talked about the faith that does justice, and that became sort of a formula for a lot of apostolic work. And in this letter, the general says that the work of faith, the work of justice and faith has to now include environmental sustainability. That if we're going to work for a just world, we have to work for an ecologically responsible world. So there is some hope in the Jesuit community that they'll address this.
Absolutely. And as I say, if we don't challenge one another, we have to do this together. But I appreciate your point. I have read this, and there are people who are saying it's too late. That's what I worry about. I don't think it's too late, and I think we can work. Do you teach in the theology department?
No, I've just retired from the School of Education.
Okay. Thank you.
At least
Yes.
in front of you. Didn't you have a question? Oh, okay. Mentioned John, Mayor Southard and John in Chicago, who his letter.
Oh, yes. John Southard is a Jesuit.
Not Southard.
No, John Surratt.
Surratt,
is
yeah.
a Jesuit who circulated a letter among the Jesuits a few months ago that got some response as well about this issue. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, why don't you take one of you?
In the little bit I've heard about kind of this movement, there seems to be a lot of talk about moving away from anthropocentrism. And for me, that's a difficult idea coming from a particular religious tradition. And I'm wondering if anybody is looking at this kind of work from, without leaving that kind of central focus on humanity and kind of seeing humans in some ways as a level above other creation. If anyone is kind of keeping that, but still seeing a way forward for respect for the environment.
Definitely. The question, for example, of resilience now of the natural world and restoration in the natural world, we know that humans are making those decisions and undertaking those activities. And so to see the human as suddenly transcending or moving away, removing ourselves from those decision-making processes as an anthropocentric move is itself inappropriate. We have to understand our role, and that is part of the dilemma in itself. And so some people are proposing the term anthropocosmic as one way to consider the human reflecting upon ourselves, understanding ourselves in new ways. So I think the anthropic character of our reflections doesn't move the human off stage, but rather we begin to examine who are we, where have we come from, what have we come out of, and what is it that we expect in our future.
Even in this film, we say Freeman Dyson down at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton speaks about an anthropic principle, that the conditions for life to emerge and for human life to emerge were such in the process that that humans do emerge. And there's a weak anthropic principle, there's a strong anthropic principle. So evolution is suggesting that those conditions were in place for evolvability, as Stuart Kaufman might say. But how does this relate to religions? I mean, we've had a great deal with human-divine relations, right? I'm talking about the Western religions. We've had human-human relations, a great deal on social ethics and so on, and peace issues. Human-Earth relations have fallen behind, and that's the point. It's not that they weren't in the traditions, but if we ignore them, and first of all, it's almost, well, it would be incorrect to see any of this as not deeply interconnected, interdependent. We are interdependent on life itself. We can't breathe, we can't have water. When people say, why are you an environmentalist? I'm like, food, air, water, health, children, a future. I mean, this is a sense of how deeply dependent we are on astonishing processes of life. Now, just coming back, many people still want to come at the environmental issues through how humans are suffering. And as I said in the talk, I am more than empathetic for that approach. You see, there's many approaches, and that's why what we tried to do at Harvard was put up a big umbrella and say, Methodists, Presbyterians, evangelicals, Orthodox, all of these approaches are going to emerge, and they are, and that's exciting. That's work that needs to be done, you see? There's not one approach in Judaism or Christianity or Islam. But I want to really call out, John keeps using this wonderful word, I think, anthropocosmic. And Due Ming, a Confucian scholar at Harvard, was one who used it. It probably came from Mircea Eliade, who was a historian of religion at Chicago. But from the East Asian traditions, which have influenced me enormously and influenced Thomas Berry hugely, there is a very profound sense in Confucianism and Taoism that we humans complete the cosmic and earth processes. And one of the great texts, called The Doctrine of the Mean, says if we can work with the transforming and nourishing processes of heaven and earth, I mean cosmos and earth, we complete this whole huge processes of life. That's what an anthropocosmic notion is. It's very, very powerful, very rich.
Let me just to tag a footnote on here too. Certainly your question regarding the role of the human or the movement of the human is generated of late by the last 2 decades and the concern for postmodern thought to open the question beyond human rationality. So Thomas Berry would make this statement. He would say, the glory of the human is becoming the desolation of the earth. And it's a shocking statement, but what I think he was trying to explore is part of our glory is our capacity for rational thought. But if we ratchet that rational thought and reduce all of what we are as a human, we know that we have failed to take sufficient attention to our emotional intelligence. And the moment we begin to talk about that type of sensual or our understanding of our embodiment, it reaches out into a larger world of animals, of other living reality and the mineral reality. So I think we are beginning to move past that postmodern critique where the human was severely sidelined, and we're beginning to revisit what is the nature of the human in this enterprise that we're undertaking.
Just to pick up a quick thread there, what we're also suggesting is that there are multiple ways of knowing. We need science. It's an extraordinary contribution to modernity. But our president at Yale, Peter Salovey, is a psychologist, and he has set up this summer an institute for emotional intelligence. Isn't that amazing? I was kind of astounded, but that's something he has studied. And what we're also doing, our dean at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies wants us to identify what are environmental humanities at Yale. Now, Yale is known for known for the School of the Environment, but also for humanities, okay? Fortunately, strong literature, history, and so on. We just surveyed, there's 64 courses dealing with environmental humanities in literature, man and nature in China, the history of China, Peter Perdue, and so on. It is amazing. And I believe you're doing this as well, right? Yes. Would you like to say something about your work?
Thank you. My name is Lin Zhang. I'm assistant professor in history. I'm studying medieval China, environmental history China. So actually I did a postdoc at agrarian studies at Yale. So study with James Scott and a bunch of other scholars from different fields. We sat down to talk about slow food movement, all sorts of things related to environmental studies. Yeah, so, well, thank you.
I understand you're working on the Yangtze River and Yellow River, I mean, yes.
That would be an interesting project for a student to identify what are the courses in the humanities here that have environmental connections. Good project.
Bring science and humanities and social science together. I think this young lady, we'll try and be shorter in our answers now. You had in this.
Hi, I just wondered in all of your academic in your partnerships with and conferences with different institutions, if you had any dialogues with the business schools of institutions, because I think economics is going to be huge in this.
Yes, Good.
Yeah, so that's why we showed Richard Norgaard is one of the founders of ecological economics. We had these partners involved in all of the conferences. We've worked with socially responsible investment, series, and so on. There's
Degrowth.
a degrowth initiative. There's such a range of initiatives. The UN has reporting, cost accounting, and so on. So absolutely, and in fact, we have a joint master's with the School of Business at School of Management at Yale. So my brother's head of Chubb Insurance in New York. We talk all the time about climate change and insurance, and why is it that the reinsurance industries, Munich Re and Swiss Re, are all over this issue? It's all over it. But the other ordinary, insurance companies are not insuring coastal water properties, in case you haven't noticed up here in Boston. Anyway, okay, Barbara.
Very appropriate question.
Thank you. Very, very important. Yeah, hugely.
I wondered how your work is intersecting with concern about feminism.
Wonderful question. So let me just say, Rosemary Ruther, Sally McFaig, Beth Johnson, some of our leading ecofeminists and feminist theologians came to the conference at Harvard that we did in '97 on Christianity and ecology, and Sally McFaig said, this will be the work I will do the rest of my life. I think all of them have been deeply influenced by Thomas Berry and this universe story, and they have picked it up in their own language and so on. But I appreciate your question enormously, because one of the things I'm trying to do as a woman is find my own voice. It's not easy in academia. You can be so crushed, in case you didn't notice. And that's why I keep emphasizing this important with frank partners, with scientists and economists, hard questions, you see? This isn't just about, lovey-dovey feelings and so on. We have got, and this is the challenge, for those of us who feel that religions, despite their problem, might have something to contribute here, how do we talk about religion in a way that actually makes sense? We don't have to just apologize, they're all terrible. But to bring this to the table, to start this as a new field at Harvard, brutal, absolutely brutal. And I can tell you, I absolutely love Yale, but I don't think some of the scientists, they don't care, and it's okay. And nor do they understand, because the minute religion is mentioned, it's like off the table. And what I like to think about is we are dealing with cultural values from all over the world. And so the lens of culture, and I think women understand a lot about culture, so that's my entry in. The culture of China and India are going to enter this conversation in very, very different ways. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You highlighted the difficulty of promoting persuasion and fostering persuasion and a greater awareness of the need of caring for the planet. You stress also the important role of religious leaders, scientists, and you focused on the academia. But if we look at this as an attention given to what is from top down, and we reverse the attention. If I think of myself in a village in an African country, what would be practices that would help me as a believer, but not in a position of responsibility or power, except in my own environment? And what if we extend this attention to practices to different corners of the world? So the more developed countries and the less developed countries. Mm-hmm. What would be some examples that you would suggest to reverse the approach from the top down to the bottom up?
So,
thank you.
A student this year at in the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, they have a project called Mid-Level Career, and he's come from Congo, and he's come by way of religious schools so that there is funding so that he could make this trip, and his aptitude is obvious and his commitment is right on target. But his questions for us when we get together is, what is it that you're saying that has meaning for my people in the Congo? So that's how I'm hearing your question, and Mary Evelyn can take it another direction. But one of the discussions that we're having with Dominic is the character of bushmeat and the relationship of the indigenous people in his home region and the marketing of bushmeat in markets for the economic livelihood of the people as well as subsistence. And are there ways that Dominic could develop resources in his studies at Yale to bring back into that community and to begin to activate again the relation, the indigenous traditions understanding with animals in terms of subsistence, both as bushmeat and also in terms of symbolic character, and maybe having deeper resources for ecotourism or for other ways of relating to biodiversity in the area other than in subsistence ways. So I think these questions they're very dense, and again, to me, I find the word resilience is surfacing in this area. What kind of resilience am I thinking about in this project in religion and ecology that the religions have built within them, but also how does it affect small-scale societies, and how do they enter into these questions? And sometimes they're very much overlapping with one another and in contestation. So your question for me is, I take very seriously.
Thank you for the question. What we said from the beginning, but we need to fix some slides in response to that, it's a field and it's a force. So on our website, we have identified hundreds of grassroots environmental religious projects, and you can see them from all over the world. That's also what Marty Ostro's renewal film did, and we had a huge conference on these grassroots environmental movements. 300 people came to Yale to study them and appreciate what people are doing. What Native peoples are doing right now in terms of trying to stop the Keystone Pipeline, we have featured this on our website. These are grassroots folks from the Nez Perce in Idaho to the Lummi in Washington state to the Salish in British Columbia. They are doing amazing work. We just had a conversation yesterday with the head of the Friends of the Earth Middle East, Gideon Bromberg, and he is working with the 3 religions in Israel and Jordan, the Abrahamic traditions on the Jordan River. And he's been doing this for 20 years, and he wants to have a conference with us at Yale, because we also worked on the Yamuna River. We had a conference about the Yamuna River in India. 60 million people depend on this river. And it was to bring the religious leaders together in one of the great pilgrimage sites, along with the scientists and so on. So yes, yes, yes. There's a lot going on. There's a lot that needs to be featured. And it's one of the reasons why we're very interested in your work on the Yellow River, too. Millions of people are depending on these rivers. Yeah.
Ask a more local question. I'm Jan Leary Campanella. I've graduated from graduate school here at BC. My 3 daughters graduated from BC. I was married to an administrator here at BC. You offered a gentle challenge to Boston College. Can you get more specific?
Well, that's a nice invitation. I'm glad you also found it to be gentle. Because, honestly, when I saw Chasing Ice, and I realized this guy came from this school, he graduated in '74, you have to see this movie. It's just incredible. He's up there in the ice caps, and his knees are falling apart and so on, and he's doing this for his children, right? So I said, let me Google what's happening at the Jesuit universities. I mean, seriously, I was sleepless about this, because Thomas Berry used to say that the universities are not doing enough. And this was 20 years ago. And I said, my God, if they're not, if the field isn't getting into academia in an even richer way, how will the force on the ground be supported? So what's the challenge? I mean, we've been working with greening of seminaries since the 80s. We had MacArthur money. We worked with Union Seminary in New York. We worked with the Chicago seminaries and Claremont. We had conferences. We've done books on what seminaries should be doing to educate people along these lines, you see. So specifically, I mean, I could speak for an hour on this. We have to get in dialogue. We've got to get good presentations from scientists on the major topics: climate change, biodiversity, toxicities, et cetera, et cetera. We have got to get these topics into our schools, and then what are the ethical responses? This is going to take a long time because it's not easy. It's not just like we have to do this, we have to do that. Anyway.
But I would also add that while the Religion and Ecology project provides one avenue or kind of a wedge issue to begin to talk about the community's understanding of these issues, that in an academic setting, environmental humanities provides a wedge also for initiating a forum in which those scientists who have an understanding and can lay it out can enter into discussion with the community of like-minded people and begin to think seriously in a forum that we do not have in this country. The universities really need to step up and provide a setting that we do not have in the larger national polity.
Thanks. It seems I'm in the noisy row. But my name's Dawn Tesserero, and I'm a lifelong environmentalist. And my question to you is, are you giving us the challenge to plant seeds right now and make them grow with 2 roads to communicate climate change? And that is, are you telling us we need a force, so we have to train the force, and we need a field, and that being the grassroots movement up? And in that concept, I mean, I started in the Catholic Church, and I've moved to Protestant, sorry. You know, went to the Catholic college, but am enjoying watching some of the Christian religions responding. One of the Christian religions that is responding, and I think it's amazing, is the Congregational Church around us. And I don't know if many of you are familiar with that, but the General Synod for the Church, the United Church of Christ, just said we are divesting. That's it. We have all agreed. And on November 4th, I'm, with the help of some bishops and other priests and lay people, we're putting forth a divestment strategy for the Episcopal Massachusetts Diocese on the east side. That's about 185 churches, to say, what are you doing? Should we get our retirement for our priests on the back of islanders that have no home?
No, I think this is great because you're again making it very specific. Jim Ontel is the UCC guy who got the whole UCC church to say we are divesting. That's why you mentioned Catherine Jefferts Schori. We lobbied with Catherine Jefferts Schori and the Church of Sweden in the spring in Washington, D.C., and you think it wasn't embarrassing to be sitting there with Swedes and Norwegians and people telling us in Nancy Pelosi's office we can't even get to first base here? They are furious with us in the rest of the world. They were so shocked. It was really horrible. Sweden has done conferences on this since 1972, the first Stockholm conference. They had an Uppsala conference on religious leaders, statements. If you look on our website, there's statements and there's actions in climate, just on climate change. A lot of great stuff is happening. More needs to happen.
So in a positive spin on that, the environmental issue, we need to take it out of the political sphere as a political, rhetorical, or a divisive issue. We need to reintroduce it in a bipartisan sense as an arena and an area and an issue, a set of issues we need to discuss together. There's a question way over on the side too. They get forgotten.
Hi, my name is TJ Buckley. I'm a student at Boston College with the divestment movement. I'm a sophomore. My question is kind of in a similar vein, bringing it more locally. Obviously, one of the most important things in the environmental movement is for people to say something or do something to contribute in some way. What do you think is one thing that everyone here can go home and do to contribute to this fight to save the world?
So the head of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, Rajendra Pachauri, has an appointment at the Forestry School at Yale, and every time he finishes the talk, he says, he's from India, he says, eat less meat. I mean, I've been vegetarian for 30 years, but you just start to think about what meat production does. I mean, we can go through this. There are 10,000 things we can do, you know. We have to have structural change. We have to have institutional change. We have to have personal lifestyle change. But just think about meat. Pretty simple.
Eat locally.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for the talk. I wanted to speak a little bit when you said that it's such a politically divisive issue. Of course, I couldn't agree. In this country, it's politically divisive. Most elsewhere, it's kind of agreed with the scientists. And I just wanted to elaborate, not all of the hands went up when we said what the divestment campaign is really about, but it's about taking the money out of these fossil fuel companies because they have a stranglehold on the political process. There's a reason why Republicans, by and large, and lots of Democrats too, do not move forward in a meaningful way on climate legislation, and that's because these fossil fuel companies have an incredible amount of power. So I just wanted to kind of let people know that that's the direction. We don't really think that taking some money out of these companies is going to do a whole lot, but it's about removing their social license. These companies are like the tobacco companies. They're like arms manufacturers. They're killing people here, now. Profiting from that is immoral.
Right, and in Chasing Ice, the Shell oil guy says, I got out of it. You know, it's a great moment in Chasing Ice when he says, I'm no longer doing that.
And one might think that in such a forum as this, to step forward and for someone to make a statement from the audience is perhaps intrusive, huh? That's not might be seen. But isn't it the case that the Occupy movement has modeled new ways for us to talk to one another? So that in an exchange like this, I think it's really appropriate for the students to stand up, seize the moment, and speak out to these things, huh? I mean, if we blah, blah, blah on, that's one thing. But if you have something to say, you say it, huh? So.
We would give twinkle fingers.
Thank you for the presentation. I think it's really critical that you're demonstrating the effectiveness of partnerships, the critical relationships that people have to develop in order for sustainability to really take hold. I'm the sustainability director for Boston College, and it is a challenge to pull together all the resources across the campus into a meaningful path that indicates that has some direction for where we're going in the future. One of the things that's pretty that I see is a very practical way, and it's one that 80% of our students are involved in, is that they reach out to people in the community. They go on mission trips. They go out into Boston. They go into the southern states. They're working for Habitat for Humanity. The thing that I really appreciate about that is that there's an undercurrent of change that happens when people do start to experience what other people's lives are like. They're impacted, they're doing it because they think, well, I should be doing this because I'm a privileged person, so I'll do it. I should do it because, geez, I'm Christian and that's something I should be doing. Or it's, we're a Jesuit institution, it should be that we reach out to people, and that's something that we do. But to have 80% of our students that are involved in these volunteer efforts is sort of like, for me, somewhat of a direction in which sustainability has to go into. Their efforts are sustainable efforts. Their actions are sustainable actions, and they bring back to the campus a new and enlightened way in which they can appreciate how other people in the world, live. Some of the sort of the understory or the back issues or the back burner issues that are going on at BC is that we are reporting on our greenhouse gas emissions, and for the last 2 years we've successfully reduced our carbon emissions by some 20%, which is great, but in a sense nobody knows about it, and it's because of a lot of the efficiencies that we've done on the facility side. my interest is to continue to work with the staff, with students and faculty on ways in which he can affect our behavior. And I think the way that students are involved in their volunteer efforts is sort of like the foothold into some of these other things that are encouraging people to think differently about the way they live.
Let's give some applause for this effort. Now, I think you all are heroes, and we tried to start at Bucknell, a greening of Bucknell, when we taught there in the 80s, and it just barely got off the ground. But now many, many universities are doing this. Yale has a tremendous sustainability program. In fact, we just lost our director to MIT. But I think to do this on the ground is extraordinary and not often fully recognized. So we really do thank you for that. My sister went to BC, and she's here today, and I'm so delighted, and I think she'd be delighted about these changes. And my grandfather, who is a historian of Europe, taught here for a semester. And I think he would be very, very pleased too. And I feel this challenge for BC and Jesuit universities and all universities to think about future generations. That's why we're here. We don't have children, but we feel our students are our children, and we are so committed to them and their future. Let's think, shall we? Collectively, across the disciplines, for all future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you.